Welcome to Identerati Office Hours, episode 31, The Three Wallet Problem with Dan Robinson on a Friday, unusually, because of my travel schedule. So I want to remind everyone, if you could follow Identerati Office Hours on LinkedIn, that would be great. We're trying to get to 1,000 followers. And so without further ado, let me introduce Dan. And Dan, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the actual topic. How did you actually land as a product guru?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So yeah, I started out during college. I co-founded a business with a partner, and that sort of slowly, like, I sort of boiled like a frog, realizing we had this weird business model. There's no off-the-shelf software, so it was first building software to kind of operate the business, and then did a bit of a pivot into a side project to build a technology product that involved software and hardware. And that was when I sort of was hooked. Like, okay, this is amazing. Like, this is kind of the right mix of creativity and business thinking, and really getting to sort of apply empathy. So that was sort of how I got into product, and then from there ended up at a big company, working in e-commerce and also some technology for retail commerce, and then onto kind of back into the startup world in the venture funded side. And so that's been my path sort of with product. And the in the identity space, I sort of at some point stumbled into the problem and became absolutely fascinated, and really started to. It was just like too much of a puzzle to resist, and so I have kind of as a side passion been following the space, and so that's how we ended up here.
Great. So a lot of our audience are Identerati and not product experts. So maybe I could just start with the basics and say, as a product manager, what's your approach to understanding user expectations for a market like decentralized identity?
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of a trope in product management circles to answer every question with "it depends," but that's because it really typically does. So I think it is, in terms of understanding user expectations, there's sort of firsthand experience. There is the experience of the folks that we've interacted with. There's reading stories, or sort of being exposed to folks from different backgrounds. And it's sort of like, I had a great history teacher who said, I love history because in order to understand history, I have to try to understand everything else to make sense of it. And I think it's a similar exercise to try to gain a broad enough perspective of people's problems and expectations. And but certainly when you have that firsthand experience, there is uh, no better leverage in terms of empathy than to understand your own problems and figure out how they are applicable.
Interesting. So what is decentralized ID tech, or not what, but why is decentralized ID tech a rising tide? And what are the potential network effects for a product like a digital wallet? Like, why is this market so potentially um, scalable?
Yeah, so if you want to talk about numbers, a great resource is the book Self-Sovereign Identity that I think was published by Manning, and there's many contributors to that book, but
Mhm.
the sort of the first act of that book, so to speak, is all of the numbers around the problems with fraud and the costs that those put onto the economy, and also sort of the unrealized opportunity around faster onboarding, higher conversion of onboarding, faster and better conversion on transactions. So from an economic standpoint, there is just an enormous amount of headroom across, kind of on both the cost and the revenue side across the economy. And so I can't go like it's multiple times a week. I have some kind of interaction that is commercial in nature, even if it's something like registering my kid for the local elementary school where I wish I had hair I could pull out because it's just like so maddening. It's like this could be 3 taps, but instead this is like a 2 week long process of trying to pull the right documents out of a safe or out of whatever and do a scan and wait, where did that go? And oh, we need to up, and it just all could be so much simpler. And so that is kind of the thing that I can't get off my mind is life could be so much better, and we could see such great economic benefits by really solving these identity problems in the digital realm uh, correctly. But it's a hard problem because of sort of the challenges of bootstrapping a network, right? Like one vendor can offer a solution in this space that's excellent, much like you could create an amazing social network to compete with the Instagrams and Twitters of the world. But if there's just a handful of people on there, it can't be a good social network. It's that same challenge in the identity space that you sort of need to bootstrap enough parties that the value starts to flow amongst those. And I see wallets as sort of the key in the decentralized ID tech space with technologies like W3 decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials. Wallets are the channels that that value needs to flow through to make that network work. And so that's sort of why it's become the subset of my obsession that I give the most energy to.
You know, I think people, when browsers came out, and I know most people are probably not this old and they don't remember that. But when browsers came out, they were exciting. Like all of a sudden, you had this thing, and it was a portal for you to get to all these, almost like places and get this content. And so there was a lot of excitement about it. But I don't think wallets is a similar piece of infrastructure in a way. It's a piece of software that's going to run on my device, made by different vendors. But not only is there maybe less than that amount of excitement, it's maybe something that people don't even know that it exists, or they don't even understand when they're using it, and they don't understand who makes it. And do you think that wallets itself, as being some type of piece of invisible personal infrastructure, presents some unique challenges from a product perspective?
Yeah, I think that wallets are very hard from a product perspective because they're you're asking a user to take on a burden that they're not accustomed to taking on when you live in the password world. There's always the fallback of, well, I'll reset my password and I'll get the email and I'll go through that flow, or I'll call this number, I'll wait on hold for however long it takes, and then I'll explain what's going on, and maybe I'll need to take some extra steps, answer some questions, but ultimately I'll get back in. And so the challenge that wallets pose is there is this baseline burden that the user is taking in exchange for the value that can be unlocked over time. And that's part of why it's so tricky, is that if however many vendors or contexts ask a user, hey, take on another wallet, that burden just stacks. And it is as opposed to taking on a baseline burden but getting a ton of value out of that one wallet, it ends up being take on that baseline burden and get some incremental value and then do it again and then do it again and then do it again. And sort of the confusion ramps up quite uncomfortably, I think, as we start to think about a world where a user is asked to take on this wallet to do X sort of activity and this other wallet to do Y, and so on. So it is a big challenge.
So I think now's probably a good time to introduce the topic of today's conversation, which is the three wallet problem. This is based on a blog, a part of I think the third part of a three-part series, or the second part. Um, and this is a diagram from that that article. And maybe you could introduce the what is the three wallet problem?
Yeah, absolutely. So the three wallet problem, the premise is by the time a user is forced to adopt their third wallet to participate in these kinds of to leverage these kinds of technologies, the natural and probably correct conclusion is this is worse for me than what I used to deal with in an old world where identity theft was prevalent and I had 250 different passwords. This is even more painful, and I'm confused and I don't know which wallet to pull when, and I've forgotten how to get into the second wallet that I adopted because and so this just sort of illustrates this premise of I'll go back to the metaphor that you pulled, which I think has. I understand when people push back because it's not the exact same a browser and an identity wallet, but I do think it is useful to think about because of the commonalities. Um, if every website that I went to, I needed to have a special browser to access that website, I would quickly conclude the web is a nonsense notion. This is not
You don't have
helpful.
to. Your web would suck.
Yes, yes.
Quickly.
And so the implications from a product strategy standpoint are we would say it's horrible product strategy if you want to make a website and you start to market a bespoke browser that is coupled with your website and it doesn't work for other websites and it's the only one that works for your website. That you're just introducing so much difficulty both for the users as well as for the growth of your business, and you're missing out on the really powerful network effects of the web, where a user can adopt a browser once, switch if she wants to, when she wants to, but ultimately that browser is going to be the gateway that or the on-ramp that she can use to get to any website, and that is what create that network effect is going to pull users in because everyone is sharing in the benefit of that new user being onboarded to this big network of the web. And so I see the dynamics as quite similar in the decentralized identity space.
So for all the engineers out there who are like, why three and not four or six? Three is just a metaphor, really, and I like it how Alice gets to ugh in three as sort of just a an example. But yeah, we're not actually saying three here. This isn't a scientifically proven theory, but
Yeah, I originally, there was a period of time where in conversations I would say we need to be mindful of what I was calling the 30 wallet problem, explaining it would be miserable to have 30 different wallet apps or whatever sort of interaction paradigm, to have 30 different places to go to handle your identity data and your identity interactions. And then at some point, kind of a light bulb went off, and it was like, oh, but we would never get to 30. Like adoption would never take us to a typical user having 30 wallets. They just couldn't do it. And the adoption, though there might be traction in certain areas, it would create these negative sort of dysfunctional dynamics that would cause the press and users via word of mouth and the commercial parties involved to all conclude and start to gain consensus around this is a horrible idea. We need to either go back to what we had or look for something different. This is a whole mess, and it was something that didn't get talked about um, enough from that I had visibility to. So that was sort of where I felt like, okay, I need to write this up. Maybe somebody will have an answer for me that helps me sleep better at night, uh, but if not, then at least I can try to sort of spread that word.
I actually think there's a better analogy than browsers, and it's push notification apps for authentication. Like the first time I got Duo Security, I'm like, oh, that's cool. I don't have to get my SMS. I'll just get a push. And then and then Zoho wanted to me install one, and then I needed to install a ping one, and then I was like, okay, I think three is about. I was by the third one, I was already tired of installing push notification apps and wondering if I'm going to have to install an app to authenticate to every website. Um, and Glue has one of these apps. We have an app called Superglue, and I've wanted to kill the product for a lot of years because I keep saying, well, A, Fido's going to take over and make the mobile experience better. And B, this is phishable. And C, who really wants to install a push notification app? But they seem to be out there. I don't know. Have you looked at those apps, or does that give you a similar feeling?
I think so. When you say a push notification app, like to get like a second factor to
Correct.
authenticate,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think there is that dynamic plays out in a lot of interactions. Um, the I think it's worse though with wallets because another sort of analogy I think about is I use one of the popular password managers, and I think it's a very good product. And I think it adds a ton of value, even though I do need to remember that single password that unlocks all the others. But if I was forced to take on the burden of a password no one can help me recover from and take on the burden of understanding all the user interactions that are involved with a particular password manager and do that over and over for every context that my life spreads into. One for a new password manager specifically for my bank passwords, and a new password manager specifically to get to my medical records, and all of a sudden the that val that cost benefit ratio of trying to have good hygiene and sort of be diligent with what I need to do to make a password manager work becomes upside down. And if you have a password manager to manage one password, a single password, I should say, there is one with that brand name of one password, but it it makes no sense to say I will store a single password in a password manager that itself has these high security standards. um, it's a similar dynamic with wallets where I'm going to take on this burden and then take on this burden and then take on this burden, and the value I get from each of those is just very incremental. And the further I go, the more frustrated I get in that scenario.
So at Internet Identity Workshop, there's a large, like I feel like 50% of the conversations or sessions are about decentralized identity. And I always ask, so where am I going to store this decentralized identity credential? In what wallet? And how's that going to work? And then it always like gets hand waved over, like, oh, I don't know, or well, that's somebody else's problem. Um, but it seems so fundamental to me because the utility comes not from the credential, but from the ability to present it and use it for your daycare or something.
Yes.
um, but do you think, maybe I'm putting you on the spot here, but do you think the decentralized identity industry is maybe ignoring at their own peril some of the issues around the challenges of wallets?
It So not entirely. I think I'm not involved with the Open Wallet Foundation, but I do try to keep an eye on what's happening, kind of with the many parties that are sort of intersecting in that space. And I do think that philosophically, that is an approach that really could address these issues. I hope that it will be. But I think the challenge is, and it's probably a greater challenge for like startups, right? You have a with you if you raise money or if you bootstrap, you need to get to traction quickly, and you don't have time to wait for community development and open source uh, options and everything that you need to unlock your use cases to come to you. So I understand the impulse to say, well, we'll build a wallet and it'll do what we need. And I think that that would take a given company so far in a best case. But the challenge is that as company A in industry A and company B in industry B start to gain traction, those those streams never cross and start to build a bigger river, so to speak. Um, and so it would take those companies so far, but then ultimately there would be greater and greater headwinds or sort of friction in that adoption curve and that revenue growth curve, as opposed to what we saw with the web, which was the more and more traction it got, the more and more traction it got. Um, in sort of the classical Metcalfe's law sort of a dynamic where the you add a new node to some communication network, and you've not just added one node, you've added a potential connection from that node to every single other one. And so the value from that next incremental user who comes onto the network is radically more than it would seem when you just look at that one user, because of all the potential connections in the big, I call it an expansive network, one where every sort of solution is sharing users with other solutions.
So if you want to get network economies of scale, probably the best way is to get on board the three biggest operating system vendors, Google, Apple, and Microsoft. And in fact, my most viewed LinkedIn post this year was actually a picture I took at IAW of Apple, Google, and Microsoft showing cross-vendor presentation of verifiable credentials, like beta stuff, not even available, but basically going from a Windows computer to using an iPhone and an Apple phone to scan a QR code to do a verifiable credential presentation from the phone. Um, and so I guess I have a hard time. I almost wonder if the wallet is something built into the operating system. And I wonder how Apple, Google, and Microsoft aren't going to be so dominant that there's any room for anyone else to come in and be a wallet vendor, maybe with the exception of somebody like the EU doing a citizen wallet where they don't trust like big tech and they don't trust Five Eyes, and they're going to do their own wallet, and you're going to be able to get healthcare from it, which is really valuable. So people are going to do it. But outside of the EU doing a wallet like that, I just don't see any room for wallet vendors or like even like a password manager or something. Who's going to want to use that?
Yeah, I do think that platforms, the big hardware and OS platforms, do introduce a sort of a variable that's hard to manage in this equation. And you mentioned there's three parts to the series of blog posts on wallets. There are four more parts that were drafted more or less before it started publishing, and I paused it because I felt like, as I saw the regulatory developments happening in the EU, I felt like, okay, I need to pause and think about how does this fit into this scenario. And I am not I'm not certain that it creates um, a force in the right direction, but I think it does have potential to. And I think it still needs some time to play out and develop. But materials I've seen seem to suggest that those OS providers will be required to support third-party wallets, like you sort of alluded to. And in other contexts, other technology contexts, I have seen regulations out of the EU sort of set a baseline in the technology industry for a lot of other geographies. So I think there may be a path, and I don't think that I don't think it would be bad for those platforms to offer good wallet solutions that really serve users with these technologies. I do worry, though, that you are stuck with those wallet solutions just because pick any product category that Apple or Google offers sort of a built-in solution for. It's not the best solution for everyone. Like, it's a pretty good solution for a lot of people, but it's not the best for everyone. And I see it as virtuous and desirable if I can opt to use one of n number of different note-taking apps, as opposed to being stuck with Apple Notes or Google Keep or whatever is their product.
Yeah.
So I would hope that we would see it play out in that way, but I think it remains to be seen.
But maybe this is a different kind of problem. This isn't just like using like a lame version of like, or using Notepad, probably the world's worst application. Um, but actually, a wallet is fundamentally the storage and protection of a private key. And we've seen the people who even understand what private keys are really bad at protecting them. And so in the FIDO space, um, which is, or let's call it the passkey space now, Apple, Google, and Microsoft have built an infrastructure to store private keys and to be able to restore them to people's devices, or to push these aggressively push these keys when you get a new device. Um, so, despite, just looking aside from the fact that, yes, they maybe won't write the best one, but are we going to actually trust anyone to protect our private keys competently? And does anyone else really have that infrastructure to protect the private keys?
Yeah, I think that it's another reason that open source community development for wallets is very important, because there is so much super critical functionality from a security standpoint as well as from a usability standpoint that uh, any given provider should not be reinventing that wheel. It is, there's a baseline of security and usability in the realm of recovery, backup recovery, um, kinds of use cases that I hope will be solved kind of once and for all in a way that everyone can settle on, and we will see if we can get there. But yeah, I would worry that even if one wallet provider finds great solutions to these problems, if they are the only product that has solved them in that way, it will be bad for the entire ecosystem, including their business in the long run. I think that there are certain problems where differentiation should not be the objective, because it will constrain that network growth, and the network growth is ultimately where the real business value can be created for each individual firm.
Right. So you mentioned from a product perspective, listening to the users, that's the key activity here. But I worry about this area because actually the wallet is one part of a larger ecosystem. And it's not just that the user needs to love the wallet, but the recipient of the credential needs to trust the wallet. So just to make this concrete, one of the first implementations of verifiable credential presentation was, I believe, the TSA, the airport security guys, basically at, I think, one of the Arizona airports, accepted a presentation of a driver's license from an Apple Wallet for the purpose of getting through airport security. So it's not that the TSA said we're not going to trust any wallet. We only trust the Apple Wallet because we know Apple has taken certain protection around um, around the protecting the private keys. And so I wonder if maybe we're focused on the user, but there, in this case, there's this bigger ecosystem of issuers and verifiers. And so while the user aspect is important, it's not the only thing that's in play here. And maybe to really be able to present these credentials, we should really be focused on the people who want to use them for stuff, the TSAs, the to pay your taxes, and ask them what they want. And maybe, so I'm wondering if maybe the product approach of listening to users here doesn't really work 100% because the user is only a small part of this larger ecosystem.
I I would agree that's definitely part of why this is a hairy problem. It's a what it is a multi-sided marketplace problem, to use sort of the popular vernacular in the product space. Um, and much like a Airbnb needs to make sense for guests as well as for hosts, the the decentralized identity space does need to make sense for all of those parties that are involved in that interaction. And you're right that some of them will be uh, large institutions. Um, my hope is that, and what happens in the EU may help to give sort of a shape to a solution, but my hope is that the uh, the alignment around standards, protocols, and even just patterns uh, will allow us to have the interoperability for a given standards based largely open source wallet to make a presentation of credentials that's verifiable cryptographically, that sort of mathematically is shown to be valid, and that it won't need to be a concern, much like uh, it's not the concern of a website, which whether I'm using Chrome or Brave as a browser, they're both complying with the standards sufficiently that I can get to website X or Y or Z and interact with that in a effective way.
I have to say, as an open source um, vendor or a company with an open source product, I bristle a little bit when I hear open source used in that context because to me it just seems like you don't care what kind of steel is used in the building. Like why do people don't care what type of how this software is built or what the development methodology is or how CVEs are handled or what's the transparency. So to me, open source seems like a non sequitur. Um, and so I'm just curious, like maybe I'm too deep in this thing and too after 15 years of glue to have an unbiased view here. But what's your view that why is open source even really important? Why does it even matter?
So I don't think that, much like users don't have any clue what rendering engine their browser uses, generally speaking. Certainly some do.
Yeah.
I'm sure some sort of have high brand affiliation there, but most have no clue. They wouldn't be familiar with that terminology. Um, it is, I think it's a really high leverage way to make an ecosystem that solves user problems well. So uh, WebKit and Chromium, or I've kind of lost track. We may have had some forking happen where I've got the names wrong, but the different open source browser engines allow a vendor like Brave to come in and, without making the enormous investment to rebuild an entire rendering engine from scratch, they can come in and really focus on the parts of the solution that do serve users in a novel way, in a way that caters to certain preferences and needs, without worrying about so much of the plumbing and wiring that's necessary to make a really high functioning compatible browser. So that's where my focus on open source comes from, is making it feasible and sustainable to offer a variety of solutions to users to suit different preferences and needs, without being sort of impossible from a cost structure standpoint, and also just fundamentally less secure across the ecosystem. Because if everyone needs to worry about each security vector uh, independently, it it is not as good as if everyone worries about them together and drives towards solving, sort of closing those holes together, or creating core functionality together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that that's fair. Um, and certainly sharing infrastructure costs makes sense, even for big companies. Like to a certain extent, Microsoft and Google and Apple don't really compete on who has the best browser these days. So to the extent that they can collaborate on these non-differentiating technologies and save money, Um, I think that's fine. And I wanted to pivot a little bit to maybe the potential applications. You mentioned maybe before the call or during the call that sometimes you work with VCs, and so if Apple and Google and Microsoft are going to certainly be a big part of this ecosystem, maybe there are some opportunities, some for higher growth in where you're not going head to head with the incumbents. Do you have any sense of maybe what some of those opportunities might look like? Or where would you be looking if you're looking for high growth areas in this wallet space?
So I think it is a question that the answer will change for over time. And early on, it feels like uh, the challenge is to stand up a uh, what Andrew Chen in his book The Cold Start Problem calls atomic networks, where like examples being when the first credit cards were rolled out, that happened in one city. It was like an airdrop via mail. Everyone in that city got a credit card, and at the same time, uh, merchants were sort of blasted with marketing and sales efforts to say, if you accept these cards on this date, everyone in the city will have one that's ready to roll with whatever it was, $400 spending limit. Now is the time to jump on, and that built a city kind of all at once that was ready to use credit cards. But if it had started with a sign at the local bank branch that said "Get a credit card," it would make no sense, because what will I do if I'm the first person to get a credit card? What will I do with that? There's many examples of this kind of dynamic. Facebook starting just at Harvard was another one where that became a standalone network that, even though no one else in the world was involved, it was sort of valuable enough for the people in that tight community to
Hmm.
find the people that they wanted to interact with. So I think the cases where you can sort of quickly complete the classic trust triangle of uh, someone issuing credentials, someone holding them, and then presenting them to someone who will verify them. Those are the use cases I think that make the most sense early on. And then I think that it will be sky's the limit at some point as adoption grows. And if we can connect each of those atomic networks, if we can say there's this solution happening with credit unions, and there's this other solution happening with healthcare, and there's another solution happening with like a university use case. If those have opportunity for those users to start to participate in one larger network, and that's where the wallets I think are key, then the growth will start to take off. And much in the way that it would have been hard to predict that we would see Netflix renting, competing with Blockbuster with a website and mailing discs, and then pivoting to streaming video on a subscription basis. That would have been hard to predict at some point early on in the web, but it did become one of the million different really interesting and valuable business opportunities once the web was mature. I think we'll see a lot of that where it would it it will just be uh, use case after use case, industry after industry that will later in the adoption cycle will realize, oh, we have huge opportunity, or a solution provider will realize this is a market that has huge opportunity to leverage these existing technologies that have been gaining steam.
I mean, there's a company called ID.me, and they issue credentials to consumers. It's accepted at, I guess it's one of the ways you can authenticate to the IRS, and um, and they really focus on the relying party as building especially in the government sector, building the relying parties who would accept their credentials, and then not just sending like free credit cards out to people, but really focusing on the value from the RP. I think it's going to be this way also in the wallet slash decentralized identity space, where the TSA accepts decentralized credentials, now I maybe have another way that if I forgot my wallet, or maybe I just like trying new things, I can try and do this with the TSA. But maybe focusing in on the relying party side, do you see any relying parties who you think are particularly interested in seeing this new paradigm? I know consumers want it. I know maybe issuers want it, but focusing on the verifiers or the relying parties, do you see any markets particularly ripe for or waiting for decentralized identity?
It feels like as AI advances and traditional means of complying with KYC requirements become more and more brittle uh, under the weight of that, I think that financial use cases may be ones where it feels like we need something that is not based on a video or a picture. We
Hmm.
need something that we can throw a bit of math at, and it can't be spoofed in a trivial way. That that makes it sound much more obvious and much more simple and easy than it is in practice, because ultimately those credentials need to have been issued and need to be brought to that verifier at the point when they're needed. But I do think that the advancement of AI to uh, make ever better deep fakes, like synthetic uh, identities, quote unquote. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that will likely become a motivator for everyone, um, when there's just no way to know who's who through the traditional means. Um, and but it is still, to use that credit card metaphor, uh, a merchant can want people to come in with credit cards, can want to accept credit cards in the abstract all that they want, but unless there's people that hold them, it it won't matter if they accept them, right? So it's the classic chicken and egg problem, and I think that problem becomes easier and easier if the wallet ecosystem is healthy enough that someone who first adopted these technologies to use with their dentist can then go to buy a car and prove the things that they need there. Like that's the rising tide, is that onboarding a user in one context and then having them already onboarded in the next context, and those streams sort of running both ways. Everyone's contributing users to the broader ecosystem, and so while you're not able to uh, use the wallet as a moat in the classic business sense, to say, like you would with most user experiences, you're also benefiting from the fact that no one else is trying to use the wallet as a moat. And so, if you're one of N providers across the broad ecosystem, yes, you're having users who have already been onboarded going out and easily adopting other products, but there is all of the other of those N providers who are potentially giving you that same kind of wind at your back.
So timing is critical for startups. I saw you mention in your blog the rising tide analogy, and I think that this is the timing of this market is somewhat uncertain. Um, and I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about how do we know, from maybe from a product perspective, what are some of the indicators that we might look for to better understand whether the timing for this technology is imminent?
I think it will. Um, I think that there is a three-way race. This is something that I probably will write about at some point. There is sort of a three-way race of sorts that's happening, and watching that race is going to help to inform how the market develops. And it is the incumbents, like the Apples, the Googles, the Microsofts, who own platforms, as they're trying to push in a direction of solving these problems better. There is the innovators, sort of the startups, the companies that are trying to advance a new paradigm, and then there is the regulatory authorities in different jurisdictions, and each of those are sort of as they move towards the ball, they kind of influence where the ball is, so to speak. The finish line for the race shifts as each of those three makes progress. And so I think that three-way race will kind of determine where things settle. Who makes progress in which direction the fastest will influence how the others respond. And so I am trying to watch the developments in the EU especially quite closely, because I think that if they offer a really viable and useful ecosystem, I think that will influence other governments and sort of provide a template to draft off of as the need for these technologies really amplifies with the advancement of AI.
So look to Brussels. Well, I guess let's call it there. Thank you for being in the hot seat for 45 minutes, Dan. You did a great job. And I just want to introduce or announce our next episode. We'll be returning to Tuesday next week. Don't forget to like or follow, rather, Identerati Office Hours on LinkedIn to help us get to 1,000 follows. And Andrew Coote will be the guest. We'll be talking about identity governance for non-human entities, what I call clients. But that should be a great conversation. Andre is a guru, and Dan, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And we will see you, audience, next